The timing for this seems to be that Nicole will speak to sort of about 45 minutes, a little bit more, and there'll be time for questions after that. That's what it looks like at the minute. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from traditional land, the land of the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge any Indigenous people present at this gathering. The Dorothy Green lecture is a key fixture in the ASAL conference schedule, a lecture given by a woman deemed to have made significant scholarly or critical contribution to the field of Australian literature. My own knowledge of Dorothy Green relates mainly to her scholarly work on Stead and Richardson, but a few years ago this was improved immeasurably by reading Sue Sheridan's excellent chapter on Dorothy Green in 9 Lives, Post-War Women Making a Mark, 2011. Dorothy Octolone Green migrated to Australia from England in the late 1920s when she was 12. Before she began academic teaching in 1961 at Monash, she worked as a university librarian, a journalist, a broadcaster, a reviewer, and a secondary school teacher. She arrived in Canberra in 1964 to teach English and Australian literature at the ANU. She then moved to the English Department, Royal Military College, Duntroon in 1976, which then became ADFA and is now UNSW Canberra. She retired in 1987 and died in 1991. During her academic career, Green undertook work on Henry Handel Richardson, Patrick White, Martin Boyd, E.L. Grant Watson, Stead, as I mentioned, and others. She remained a tireless critic and advocate for Australian literature in the public sphere as well. And in addition to this, she managed to find time to publish 3 volumes of poetry. It's fitting, therefore, to introduce another luminary representative of UNSW Canberra, Professor Nicole Moore. Nicole is a Professor of English and Media Studies and currently the Associate Dean for the Special Collections at UNSW Canberra. Nicole's research is centred in Australian literary studies and includes interdisciplinary work, particularly in the fields of within and across women's writing, cultural history and gender studies. Her interest in book history is focused through questions of censorship. She is the author of the much awarded The Censor's Library, Uncovering the Lost History of Australia's Banned Books, UQP 2012, and her work in this area continues with research into comparative accounts of censorship during the Cold War. Nicole also maintains a range of commitments to editing and publishing, as well as university governance. Funded by an ARC Future Fellowship, the current project is a biography of Dorothy Hewett. Her lecture today draws on this work and is titled, I'll Tell My Mother, Dorothy Hewett's Biography and Literary Feminism After #MeToo. Please join me in making Nicole welcome however you feel you can. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Fiona, for that lovely introduction. I wanted to start too by acknowledging and offering my ongoing thanks to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose land I live and work, noting that a significant site just here near where I live is under threat from development at the moment. Those people's generosity seeks to keep those of us who live here in the now quite fortified Canberra bubble safe and educated about the land we occupy. And I pay tribute to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people joining us, tuning in today, including members of ASAL. I also wanted to really add my thanks to Roger's tremendous efforts in getting us together in this extraordinary congruence of scholars today and yesterday and ongoing. It's been an extraordinary thing to witness, and to all the efforts of all the ASAL executive in building these experiences for us. I'm hugely grateful. And especially it's lovely to have Fiona introduce me, since we've known each other a very long time. It feels like a very lovely kind of occasion. Of course, I need to echo Anita's words to say it would have been great if we're actually in situ in North Queensland. It's Canberra, it's freezing down here, so it would have been great to be in North Queensland right now. We're there, all of you. And further to that, the strange experience of COVID. So speaking from the floor of her apartment to an invisible audience for this year's Sydney Writers' Festival in early May, Gomeroi poet Alison Whittaker drew our attention to what she calls the paradoxical intimacies of our current circumstances. So she said some parts of what she calls the apocalypse are more intimate than others. Even though we're away from each other, the stories we tell have rarely been closer. So her work then was to situate the COVID crisis within the ongoing apocalypse, as she named it, apparent to Black Australia. She was speaking before the death of George Floyd at the hands of US police, and before that drew the global Black Lives Matter movement to greater efforts. But I think her words draw attention to the ways in which we stage forms of public intimacy at the moment that appropriate the space of home for all of us, for the work of telling and thinking, and hopefully for some broad forms of transformative change, and the way that we bring that space and our notionally private selves into some kind of public concordance, which we're trying to do here, even though it's mediated by some quite rigid intersubjective conventions of video software platforms. So in these contexts, for me, I think, as I'm sure for lots of you, Lauren Ballant's concept of public intimacy is still expansively powerful as a description for the kinds of contemporary forms of collectivity and political witnessing that we're trying to do in this time of apocalypse, when feeling itself must be staged and performed and insisted upon, I guess, in order to matter. So the Me Too movement moment, which is where my paper's situated, is a connected paradigmatic instance that's now co-eval with Whittaker's moment, and centrally about the witnessing of intimacy and what we might call the betrayal of such. So my topic today, it's a difficult topic. I've got some quite difficult content, and I'm conscious that we're in a difficult medium. So I hope you're going to stay with me through as we traverse some topics that I'm hoping you can all engage with me on to further our thinking. So here is what I'm hoping. I'm just going to try and share my screen, making sure I've got my PowerPoint open. So just let me do that quickly because it's closed for some reason. Here it comes. Okay. Okay, so Fiona gave you a lovely introduction to Dorothy Green, and here's a portrait of her that usually hangs in my office. So it's very nice to actually physically show it to you. I inherited it from Paul Eggett, who had it in his office when he was here, and he got it from Dorothy herself. So it's a very lovely object in that sense. She's a ghostly colleague of mine and a precursor here, and I think of her while we fight the same fights that she fought, as Fiona mentioned the fight for the importance of literature and the humanities in contemporary education, which we all know is now under material threat, about the uses of Australian literature as such in thinking and as thinking about the world. And I've been thinking about her involvement in the Vietnam moratorium marches and anti-nuclear protest, including protests at the Australian War Memorial, and noting that anti-war protests, as well as protests about including frontier wars in memorialisation, are now no longer allowed anywhere near that institution. Dorothy Green was a small but forceful woman, and her speeches on the steps of the War Memorial were apparently galvanising. So I've always wanted to know what it took for her to speak out in her position in the late 1960s and 70s as one of the few women with a safe and senior role in literary studies in Australia. And so far, really, biographies of Green haven't been able to tell us that. We're waiting on better access to her papers, actually, which are held in the special collections at UNSW Canberra with the oversight of her children. My talk today springs from the biography of a different Dorothy. This is quite a different Dorothy. She was 8 years younger. There are some notable parallels, particularly in voicing protest, but you can see from the two photographs what kinds of Dorothy they are, not least in what it means to have an impact on the kind of history in which you participate. So in 1945, Australian poet, playwright, novelist and memoirist Dorothy Hewett published her first poem as a communist called I'm Spain. It voices the grief of war and speaks the ongoing post-war Spanish resistance to Francoist fascism. In the Spanish earth the dead men lie, their brains are streets in Madrid, with the blood caked on the white stone walls and the sky a river of blue silk through their fingers. In July 1945, the war in Europe over, Perth's communist newspaper, The Workers' Star, where Hewett was a journalist, was reminding its readers that parts of Europe remained in fascist hands. In one country, in Spain, there's still a bloody fascist dictatorship which continues to suppress the people in the most ruthless and brutal manner. The free peoples of the world owe a debt of honour to the Spanish people to help them win their freedom. The great resistance riders of the Spanish Civil War were part of the first months of Hewett's communist education, especially left poet Federico Garcia Lorca, shot by the fascist nationalists in 1936, and his comrade, the Chilean Pablo Neruda, who'd rejected his own typically metaphysical poetry to write directly of the horror for him. Hewett's poem is haunted by the famous repeated lines of "I'm explaining a few things" in Neruda's poem from 1937 about the coming of war to his house in Madrid. The last lines are, "Come and see the blood in the streets, come and see the blood in the streets, come and see the blood in the streets." So it's a literal call to arms, and not just for writers, to which Hewett responded with some fervour. In 1962, her poem "My Party is the Party of Aragon" listed Neruda among those writers whose revolutionary aesthetics were keeping her in the Communist Party, despite their revelations from 1957 and onwards about the crimes of Stalin and the murderous record of the USSR. "I'm not alone. In the beating of my heart are the songs of Lumumba, the poems of Pablo Neruda. The rail splitters wake in my heart each morning. Brecht's lost children wander through the Polish snow. With Nazim Hikmet I will see beautiful days, and my party is the party of Aragon." Starstruck, she was there to hear Neruda read at a writers' congress in East Germany in 1965. His "Let the Rail Splitter Awake" from 1948 could be one of the most apposite poems of resistance, revolution and intersectional allegiance to read right now, with its vision of Abe Lincoln lifting up a rail splitter axe against the slave owners in his own hometown, insisting that Black Lives Matter to American power. But I won't read it, and I won't, because as part of the Ni Una Menos and Me Too movements, Chilean women activists have reminded us of Neruda's confession in his 1974 memoir, I Confess That I Have Lived, of his rape of a Sri Lankan woman come to clean his house and toilet while he was living in Colombo in 1929. And you can see there on the right an artwork by Chilean artist Carla Moreno, her portrait of Pablo Neruda, I Confess That I Have Raped, with that subtitle. In 2017, the Me Too movement, initiated by Tarana Burke and others in 2006 to promote solidarity among girls and young women of colour who'd experienced sexual abuse, was resonating strongly internationally as public testimony built against Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein and as other historic sexual abuse charges against powerful men were acted upon and prosecuted. In October 2017, Me Too was amplified as a social media phenomenon, you might recall, by a tweet from actress Alyssa Milano. In response to a friend's suggestion, she asked, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. And within 45 days, hashtag Me Too had been active in 85 countries and tweeted over 85 million times. By the middle of 2018, which for me was also a midpoint in writing the biography of Dorothy Hewett, her daughters, writers and academics, Kate Lilley and Rosanna Lilley, felt the time was right to each publish a book revealing their sexual abuse as teenagers in the 1970s, with the complicit oversight of their parents, what we might call the complicit oversight of their parents. As they both acknowledged, their experiences were never secret, at least not to the people involved, not to some who knew them well from that period, and not to those who know them well now. "This has all been very well known for a very long time," said Kate Lilley somewhat wearily in an interview with Claire Nichols for the ABC. Her and her sister's experiences feature in some of Hewett's poetry and are traceable too in the work of some of the men involved, most of them creative producers, poets, film and theatre makers, a photographer, actors, artists, a publisher, students. And Kate's and Rose's testimonies were already part of my research for the biography. I'd made an attempt at grappling with some of Rose's experiences in print in 2015. But as Kate said, the Me Too revelation showed her that, quote, "This is a moment to risk something more explicit." So the sisters' disclosures provoked a full-blown press scandal, as you may recall, and we can see the scandal shows us something of the risks Kate saw in speaking more publicly and the risks that are still apparent to both women in identifying the men involved. They named 3 of the dead men: filmmaker and speechwriter Bob Ellis, high-profile artist and printmaker Martin Sharp, and British photographer and filmmaker David Hamilton, who committed suicide in 2016 after being accused of rape by 4 more of his former child models. And there are numbers of others still active, still writing and producing, and we can say more than a handful. They know who they are. They know we're speaking about them. Rose intimated to the Australian newspaper for the article by Rosemary Neal that instigated the press attention. And there's a risk for me today under Australia's current defamation laws in too transparently describing any living individual's participation in Kate's and Rose's abuse. But the risk is not only to the reputation of the perpetrators, or thus via defamation law to Kate and Rose as accusers, though that should be a central focus, I think. Both sisters have been asked insistently to consider the impact of their revelations on the literary reputation of their mother and to a lesser extent their father, writer Merv Lilley. Rose has been herself insistently clear, however, that this is not the sisters' risk to bear. As we can see them now in 2020, these revelations form a key Me Too moment in Australia, in the wake of which what some might view as the betrayals of sexual liberation and second-wave feminism have been held up for a new scrutiny. For us today, I want to reread Hewett's work, especially her poetry, by considering her daughter's works as examples of what Lee Gilmore identifies as Me Too lit. What I hope to be able to do is to put some pressure on and examine the contrary rhetorical work of, on the one hand, shame, and on the other, what we may call freedom, both sexual or more broadly political liberation, and the freedom to speak, in the thickly populous intertexts of rape culture that surround Hewett's biography. So in Rosanna Lilley's hybrid memoir poetry collection, the title is Do Oysters Get Bored?, which is from a question asked by her son, whose life with autism she also explores in the book. Rose muses that poetry, I think it would be fair to say, has partly written my life. Kate Lilley's poetry collection, Tilt, is at least as self-conscious in its concentrated engagement with the literary and filmic archive that has been determining for both sisters. Its title is a reference to a Brooke Shields vehicle from 1979, in which Shields plays a pinball wizard, aged 14, and which was filmed between her role as a child sex worker in Louis Maille's Pretty Baby, aged 11, and her starring role nude in The Blue Lagoon, aged 15. Pretty Baby caused what Rachel Cole couches as a moral panic on its release in Australia, as in the US, that concern its effect not on audiences but on the child actor. Terry Shields, Brooke Shields' mother, has been famously defiant about suggestions that appearing in the film was damaging for her daughter. However, reportedly asking her, "Are you proud of what you did? Well then, fuck 'em." In her 2014 memoir, There Was a Little Girl, My Mother and Me, Brooke Shields continued to defend the film and the actions of her mother. And Terry Shields' position throws into relief for us, I think, the key role of shame in how such harm is both experienced and enacted, locating it for her in the judgment to which her daughter was subject, rather than in the forms of what can be called sexualisation that she faced while performing the role. The question is the degree to which the harm resides in the shame. How much of the harm is concentrated there? Could such harm be effectively shrugged off, resisted, refused, as Terry Shields and Dorothy Hewett both perhaps believed? Lilley's Tilt is deeply embedded in the culture of the mid-1970s, and film is a prominent aspect of the whole collection. Her interest in the queer cinema of Hollywood's silent era and the object realia of Greta Garbo's estate are bouncing off the investments of her mother and also of Susan Sontag, both of whom didn't just adore Garbo but wanted to be her. In 1978, due in large part to their mother's connections in the Sydney theatre and film world, Kate and Rose appeared in Fred Skepsi's film of Keneally's The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, aged 17 and 15, playing a pair of murdered sisters, alongside Keneally himself as a cook, and Alexandra Sepsi, the director's baby daughter. The year before, Rose had featured prominently in the film Journey Among Women, an extraordinary part of Hewett's otherwise minimal writing for the screen. Co-written with John Wiley, who went on to establish Sydney's IMAX cinema, and the director Tom Cowan, Journey Among Women had the tagline, 9 women convicts escape from a prison hellhole and dare to create a savage world free of man. With a cast of feminist actors, including now acclaimed Pitjantjatjara, Lilley, actor Lillian Crombie, and a number of feminist crew, its premise is to expose the sexual violence at the base of the settler national narrative, though it had sense that directed at Indigenous people from that expose. But with a conflicted cinematic gaze, often dominated by the camera's assertive objectification of the women, it was given an R rating. At 14, Rose played a convict called Emily, who, along with other female characters, appears topless and is raped. This experience, among others, informed her testimony to the recent Royal Commission on Child Abuse's inquiries into the entertainment industry. Her poem, Soap Opera, from doo-wop Oysters Get Bored, records her father discovering Rose on set, quote, crouched and vomiting, plied with cheap booze. He'd seen too much. And taking her home, where she found her mother upstairs having sex with a man neither of them knew. Besides Brooke Shields, Kate uses the case of Juanita Nielsen, a journalist active about the Green Band's campaign in King's Cross, close to where they lived in Surrey Hills, who disappeared in July 1975, and the case of Anita Cobby, a nurse who was raped, beaten and murdered by 5 men in 1986, to highlight the jeopardy then frighteningly proximate to Sydney's teenage girls and young women. In Tilt, the title poem, the Academy Twin Cinema in Paddington is Kate's second home, opened with Roman Polanski's Macbeth, notably in 1974, as the poem records, and where she watched Philip Noyce's Heat Wave with Judy Davis starring as a Nielsen-style activist in 1982. A poem called Pastoral recalls a school friend inviting her to a Sunday afternoon double of the story of O and Emmanuel, the two most famous of the French softcore feature films of the 1970s, released in mainstream cinemas in the wake of 1972's Deep Throat, the first conventionally pornographic film to reach blockbuster status. It made a star of Linda Lovelace, who soon afterwards testified that she was coerced and sexually assaulted during its filming. From Sydney's 1970s, at least 3 more film and theatre intertexts push at the boundaries of Lilley's collection. There's Patrick White's The Night the Prowler from 1978, directed by Jim Sharman, who also directed Hewett's doomed play Pandora's Cross, produced to open and then bankrupt the New Paris Theatre in the same year, the year Kate finished high school and Rose followed her in leaving home. The poster for Pandora's Cross, designed by Martin Sharp himself and featuring a woman wearing only a heart-shaped G-string, if that's what she's wearing, was condemned by Fairfax media as obscene and by some Sydney feminists, notably, as sexist and inciting rape. The Night the Prowler is centrally about sexual assault, notionally inverting the narrative by having a young woman stalked in her bed by the prowler herself become the sexual aggressor, breaking into men's bedrooms with a knife. It features a short cameo of Hewett herself, with Merv Lilley as bystanders scripted in for fun. The other is, of course, Puberty Blues, the film released in 1981 from the 1979 novel by Kathy Lett and Gabrielle Carey, written while they were schoolgirls, just 2 years and 1 year older than Kate, and in 1979, aged 21 and 20. Its central sexual assault is a gang rape of a teenager in the back of a panel van. When we trace the connections also to the writing scene via Hewett's work for both Lilley texts, it can be quite difficult to find a way through the thicket of intertextual references to coerced sex, underage sex, and exploitative sex. The way through might be called Harm's Way, using the title of the second section in Tilt. Yet the poems of the first section, those that address the revelations explicitly, are perhaps the most direct of Kate Lilley's career, with an anger that culminates in a poem addressed to her mother in bold capitals, throwing insults at the myths that sustained her. Fat feminism, fat communism, fat adultery, your unforgivable largesse, fuck the obituaries. At least you'll never read them, you who read everything. And the poem from Kate, in which readers of Hewett, as I have been an author of one of the obituaries, are hardest met if we read closely, is Party Favour. initially about coercive drunken sex in a bathroom with a man, quote, twice my age. The poem finishes with a second instance, with the man who won't take no, a few months later, the visiting poet. And the last stanza reads, I'll tell my mother and she'll say, she asked him, he said I was into it. From then on, I know it's pointless. She's not on my side. This instance of rape, if different from the kinds of sex the underage Lilley girls felt compelled to perform or felt met the approval of those around them or felt made them into adults, is brought into speech in some of the most unadorned, pared-back language that Lilley has reached for. Stripped of punctuation, the syntax is sheared away. And of the poetic intertext that precede it, the most devastating is Hewett's untitled poem from 1979's Greenhouse. In this romantic house, each door is peeled for rapists, randy poets and their lovers. Young men in jeans play out seductive ballets, partner my naked girls, scripts by Polanski, Russell, Nabokov. Black butterflies fly tandem in the garden. The golden ball is tossed to make its shadow. Tired of loving men who love my daughters. I wrinkle, waiting for a prince. In streams of airy light you hesitate. They are your surrogates. Ah, flatterer, behind the hedges of pittosporum and mock orange, waits, panda, madam, maiden. The very definition of romantic, joked Rose on social media. In an interview with me, Kate recalled them having to go to readings around age 13 and 15, where such poems would feature, quote, complaining about us, you know, tired of loving men who love my daughters, or something, the line, or very sarcastic things about my beautiful daughters. And me and Rosie would be standing there, look at each other and go, yeah. Greenhouse, Hewett's collection from 1979 that this poem opens, is dedicated to fellow poets Robert Adamson, Michael Driscoll, Tim Thorne and Gwen Harwood, quote, obsessively loving Rimbaud and Wittgenstein. And this is what Hewett means by romantic. Precisely, she glossed romantic as, quote, the risk life and the search or the journey to find the other, as she outlined in a 1979 review of collections from Adamson and from Michael Dransfield. The latter before and after his drug-related death in 1973, one of the most romantic, perhaps, of the 70s new wave poets in Australia. In this 1979 review, Hewett identified what she saw as the dangers of the position occupied by these dropout male hero poets. Quote, there was always the danger that the freeing of the ego for good or evil through the principle of energy would turn out to be only a circuitous trip back to the cell of the small round skull by a stranger, a wanderer unable to gain ego room or to be at home in the world. So this was her critique, she saw, of the dangers of romanticism. But it's clear that its promise, this promise of the freeing of the ego, was hugely appealing for her, even in her university years. Poetry's ego bound, she wrote in her notes for her modern poetry course, UWA, in 1941. While this is yet a position barely occupied by women poets, we would say, in Australia's history. Gwen Harwood she'd met in Tasmania, their senses of humour chiming with a shared love of mischief and gossip. Though Harwood's work disrupting patriarchal suburban pieties in the 1960s, as Hewett's did, is too polished and formalist for such an epithet. The male poets, though, and more than those Hewett named, dedicated their works to Hewett in turn, and indictably, we might say, also to her daughters. And what do we do with such poems now, you might say, in the voice of a rapist? Dedicated to a 15-year-old Rose Lilley by a 33-year-old man. One is titled Campus Pituit, or Open Field, and I'm not going to give this poem to you on the screen, I'll just read it. The vital white, the calm face, the person who does not know and is small. It's just a part of it. This one was mailed to Rose in 1978 after the poet had returned home to his wife. It's cited in one of Rose's 2018 poems, which she denotes itself a verse returned. She knows what to do with such poems. Many of those in Du Oysters Get Bored are such coded riposts. The identities of their addressees, her abusers, clear if you know what to read for. My mother's lover scuttled across the room, ink barely dry, the belt unbuckled, tan trousers slid down skinny legs, pale as an undertaker in a B-grade midday movie I'm watching with my sister on mid-century sofa. And what do we do with a poem like The Theses from the same poet, in which the scene of writing is perhaps, and perhaps too appallingly too, the scene of the crime? So this is the transition. You have freedom now, passive. No violence is being done to your breasts as areolae recede, leaving the nipples like stem barrels. As you unlearn trust, your demands will settle into shape. You will aim from the heart. It was an intently literary culture in which this abuse was enabled, and tellingly for us, this is also where the evidential traces remain. The perpetrators were poets, artists, filmmakers, as I said. Both Dorothy and Merv were writers, and Dorothy's son Tom Flood is an accomplished novelist and songwriter. The Lilley sisters' experiences were mediated even at point of origin by what a Hewett scholar might frame as the mythic literary. Raised in a present and future literary archive is how Kate described it in her 2010 Dorothy Green lecture about her mother's manuscript papers. And it is not a different moment for them when at the end of this poem, the speaker demands of his subject muse, naked, spoken over, spoken for, betrayed, collect your thoughts and turn them over to us. So, of course, both daughters speak through the literary too. Their story of abused sisters can be seen to be compelled by that of Philomela and Procne in Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which Philomela is raped and her tongue cut out by Procne's husband, Tereus. Philomela instead shapes her story into a tapestry for her sister. Then horrific revenge is enacted by the sister's murder of Procne's son with Tereus, and all three become birds. Procne a nightingale, able to sing, Philomela a swallow, and Tereus a hoopoe, able only to make sound. The motifs of silencing and enraged speech repeat structurally, of course, in the expanding archive of Me Too Lit, which, like second wave literary feminism, has invoked Philomela's story repeatedly. We could look at Susan Brown Miller, some of the other second wave feminists writing about rape. Paisley Rechdale uses the myth to argue that what she terms traumatic time, quote, works like lyric time, the now of terror repeatedly breaking back through the crust of one's consciousness. Mia Yu has in turn identified what she calls the Me Too lyric in a recent essay on women poet Adelaide Ivánova, her 2019 volume, The Hammer, translated from the Portuguese. Yu cites the last lines from Ivanova's poem, The Sow. She asks me why didn't I scream since I wasn't gagged. I don't answer, but I know we're all born with a gag. With its lowercase I, The Sow has even less mediating punctuation and formal linguistic syntax than Kate Lilley's Party Favour. And its voice seeks a revelatory candour that not merely testifies to, but we could say asserts a shared reality, unspoken till this moment, but known. The speaker can't answer about her own gag. Yu reads this last line, we're all born with a gag, as an instance of Ivanova's refusal of the romantic lyric I, quote, feeling confessing itself to itself, as she says, according to John Stuart Mill's formulation. We could return to Neruda's confession, his memoir's exculpatory title, I Confess That I Have Lived. Ivanova refuses the lyric I in favour of what Yu terms a lyric me, the direct object of a globalised system of repression and violence, she says, that absolutely determines the time, context and body from which the speaker can speak. If we look for them, rape and coerced sex are everywhere in Hewett's work. In her poetry's preoccupation with Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott is a thread about despoiling and shame. For Rapunzel too. Her version of Leda and the Swan via Yeats is called Weathercocks from 1972. A cold beak nuzzling at our napes, a talon probing at our will, gripped fast beneath the darkening beast before the giddy fall. Also reversioning Yeats' Staggering Girl is The Witnesses from 1968, one of her most anthologised poems, with its accomplished rhyme and sonority and its repeated line, the hawk in the high sky hung in the shadow of Hopkins. Its violence witnesses the threat to young women in the bush, to the golden girl of the utopic settler landscape of her childhood. The girl with the haystack hair awry, her legs outflung and her brief blood dry. Mrs. Porter and the Angels, a now barely performable play she wrote in 1968 after This Old Man Comes Rolling Home was reviewed as a little old-fashioned, That play took on the tenor of the times as a suburban satire taken up an absurdist notch, with sex and confrontational obscenity as its keynotes. One surviving ending includes what Hewett scripts as a violent and terrifying gangbang, which simulates the rape of two young people on stage, while a grandmother figure boasts about her foot-long rubber dildo, quote, "Beat that, you bloody fairies." It could be the voice of Auntie Jack, if any of you remember that figure. Both of her late novels feature fatal sexual violence for central women characters. Wildcard, Hewett's memoir covering the first half of her life from 1990, recalls an instance in which as a young woman she fended off attempts to have sex with her against her will with bitter words, a version of which features in The Chapel Perilous 2, as well as a different lover's attempt to strangle her when she broke off their relationship. She was subject to years of domestic violence in her 9-year relationship with Les Flood in the 1950s, though she describes no sexual violence. There's also the instance of sexual harassment in her youth, highlighted recently by Anne-Marie Priest as evidence of a vulnerability for Hewett and of the double standards of the adults in her life. This is even as Hewett describes her interest in frequent and varied sexual activity as a young woman during the Second World War and later, recording her own reputation as the university bike, as she records it, but determinedly, in her candour, refusing the shame required by such. So, theorists debate whether shame is an emotion or an affect. Insofar as it may be embodied and not linguistic, shame can be an instance of those affective moments of opacity traced by psychoanalysis as dissociated from their cause and non-linear in their manifestation. Elspeth Probyn, in her 2005 book Blush, uses affect theory and the influential American psychologist Sylvan Tompkins to pursue the question, but Tompkins wants to argue that shame is a response that only operates, quote, after interest or enjoyment has been activated, that is, towards the person by whom you feel shamed. Insofar as shame is an intersubjective affect, you can only feel shamed by someone in whom you're invested, he suggests. If you don't care, you're not ashamed. With its close focus on the individual intersubjective realm, I think that this formulation is relatively uninterested in shame's force for normativity as a social structure or its deployment via what might be perceived as morality. By Probyn, shame is assertively individualised. She says, what shames me may not shame you. Timothy Bewes, in his work on shame and post-colonial writing, distinguishes between what he discerns as a rhetoric of shame, he says, operating ideologically as a frame, and what he calls, quote, a shame event, whose existence one might attempt to theorise without getting ensnared in discourses of ideology, power inequality, or interests. And I think that this latter is a category I can't really accept, insofar as shame is a socially impelled affect, impelled in fact by judgment, we might say tangled in power. There is no liberal freeing it from such. Bewes is pursuing an argument that shame is related to inadequacies of form in representing experience, at least in the colonial, post-colonial context. Reading Coetzee, or more precisely reading Coetzee's Disgrace, with its galvanising scenes of sexual harassment and rape from the point of view of the abuser, though Bewes does not address this really quite explicitly enough, I think. He asks whether shame is, in fact, iterable. He wants to say that the question, is shame iterable, dramatises a deep misgiving at the heart of literary activity in the modern period. The most direct manifestation of that misgiving, he's arguing, is the thematic presence of shame in the work of a number of writers such as Coetzee, which should be understood as an intimation that there is no positive ethical or political dimension to writing, or to intellectual activity in general, or to any such index of the presence of humanity. Action, expression, and perception are, in this thematisation, regarded not as positive entities, but negative ones. The very ontology of writing is negative, he says, or to use a more technical, less tendentious term, subtractive. So I hope you're coming with me a little bit in understanding that what he's arguing here, I think I recognise this really as the shame of the perpetrator, for whom, as for Bewes, a victim is equal to an effect merely and not an agent, not a speaker or a writer. It is not shame paradigmatically that confronts, quote, equally unacceptable alternatives, silence and speaking, as Bewes suggests, for Coetzee's Diary of a Bad Year, but the shame of the perpetrator, whose existence has presumed the freedoms of speech and agency. The shamed rather than shameful victim may confront such alternatives, but these are not at all necessarily unacceptable. Silence remains perfectly acceptable for the social functioning of shamed subjectivity, often required, in fact, for such. And speaking may be unacceptable for the social world, but the grasping at such where this is possible, we might say is enabling rather than unacceptable for the shamed victim, for those rendered object, speaking as me. Such as speaking is impossible for Coetzee, of course, with his silenced Friday in Faux, waiting for that day, quote, till by art we have found a means of giving voice to Friday, rather than a Friday who spoke all along his anger unheard by art. A negative ontology for writing, we might say, is impelled by shame only insofar as such shame may be felt to be deserved. For Linda Alcott, in her recent work on rape, quote, shame is a self-directed feeling with both moral and cognitive content. It involves a sense of one's own state in relation to a world of others, one's physical as well as moral state. As she agrees, it's necessarily relational. One feels shame only in relation to others' perceived judgment or one's difference from others' perceived superiority. And as Alcott notes, it's a condition long attributed in many societies around the world to the victims of sexual violation by a logic that we now consider absurd. Yet the fact that victims sometimes experience shame in place of anger looks to be a good candidate for the claim that a person is following a conventional script. So if we want to look at shame as a structured social emotion, not only an affect then, and with attention to what historian of emotions Favour pursues as the, quote, the fine normative balance between humility in the face of wrongdoing and humiliation, between shame as righteous and shame as abject, then this thicket of intertexts around Hewett and her daughter's experiences is one place in which we can see how those structures are built and inhabited. Hewett's broad body of work, including Wildcard and her poetry, but also and perhaps in particular her writing for the theatre of the late 1960s and mid-1970s, embraces a refusal of social shame about women's sexual desires and activities, about sex in general, that was otherwise socially pervasive via those conventional scripts and even politically enforced via regimes of censorship in mid-century Australia. And insofar as there is a model of women's freedom at issue in Hewett's work, in The Chapel Perilous centrally from 1971, in The Beautiful Mrs. Portland and the Tuddy Hollow story of 1976, her Rapunzel in Suburbia collection from 1975, as well as Journey Among Women, that's just to highlight work from the 70s. The form that liberation takes is often expressed by desirous sexual behaviour, and what women are usually being liberated from is social shaming. Shame is what Hewett was trying to remove, refuse or resist. For herself, certainly in her disinhibited embrace of many sexual partners, especially in the 1970s and sometimes with the partners of her daughters, and in supposedly freeing her daughters to experience sex without moral strictures notionally, or condemnation around sin for them too. And yet this is precisely what both her daughters feel as one of the biggest burdens their experiences have given them. Speaking out and naming these as abuse frees them from shame. On the Sunday project with Lisa Wilkinson, Rose Lilley observed that it was, quote, very tiring going public with the story for both sisters, but that, quote, every time you tell it, you feel a little bit less ashamed. So this thicket of intertext from the 1970s also allows us to think about whether what we're viewing in this movement between freedom and shame might be shifts in what William Reddy describes as an emotional regime. He wants to think of an emotional regime as an emotional normative order enforced by any enduring political regime. Insofar as emotions can be both descriptive and performative, they're simultaneously personal and social, creating meanings for individuals, but also contributing to an overarching emotional culture or order, which is in turn, quote, shaped by reigning systems of power. We can make a case that what this abuse archive shows us, I think, is an historical crisis in the emotional regime of shame, and perhaps it was specific to the mid-1970s in the Western world, where some of the complex and contradictory outcomes of feminism and sexual liberation's critique of its operations opened cracks in the policing of the regime, and thus, perhaps paradoxically too, created opportunities for its furtherance in different forms. Opportunism was certainly what we see in the jarring visual dissonance of Journey Among Women, and some evidence of what it meant that it was then and remains now so difficult for women to fully control the means of cultural production. On one side is early liberation's focus on the rights of the child and the validation of teenage sexuality as a form of self-expression. On the other is the exploitation and co-option of underage children and young people by adults for adults. In 1976 and 1977, on a visit to Sydney, US experts on child sexual abuse, Dr. Judy Ann Denson-Gerber and Dr. Michael Baden, claimed that the city had the largest circulation of child pornography of any city they knew. Media reports drew links between this increased availability and what were reported as increasing rates of child abuse. In the history of print censorship in Australia, this was the point at which the post-60s hard fought for social consensus that all censorship was bad and that what mattered most was the rights of adults to read and view what they wanted. This is the moment we can see that consensus ended its brief life. Conservatives have called the 1970s the Devil's Decade, as Murdoch columnist Miranda Devine termed it in her thinly thought through polemic published after the revelations. Jeff Sparrow's more thoughtful response in Overland defended the achievements of sexual liberation and second wave feminism from such critics, including notably pointing to the belated legal requirement for consent to sex in marriage, implemented in some states only in the mid-90s, and principally the central tenet of a woman's right to control her own body. If the personal is political, that itself is a refusal of shame. Liberation movements have been part of the long history traced by Ute Freevert in her New History of Shame of the democratisation of the right to dignity and honour in the struggle by dominated peoples to create themselves as self-governing subjects, quote, who do not need noisy and disorderly rituals of public humiliation to live in peace together. Freevert reminds us that sexual abuse itself can be an act of shaming, especially in war. And in her history, the Me Too movement participates in what are identified as forms of counter-shaming. Refusing what Gilmore and others term, quote, the burden of doubt, which can operate as another form of shaming, Rose's and Kate's work also performs such counter-shaming in a context where legal recourse is not sufficiently accessible under Australian law. If Me Too is itself participating in or creating a moment of epistemic friction, disrupting emotional regimes, it's also clear, as Ixta Mari observes, that Me Too lit specifically and powerfully can, quote, create a forum for litigating sexual violence claims outside of the failed state. An Amy Whitting story from 1974 called A Piece of This Puzzle is Missing was published in the period's quintessential alternative literary mag tabloid story from 1974. And it's spoken by a woman who's literally unable to say no. The man she thus ends up supporting, in order for him to write about sex, pressures her for anal sex. He says, why can't you understand we're free to do as we like? She says, with my back to the wall, so to speak, I did better than usual. Is there such a thing as being free not to do something? The solution is to write her refusal down. So she writes him a note with the words 3 inches high, piss off, piss off, piss off. All right, that's where I'm going to leave you, I'm not telling you to piss off, but that's the end. All right, I'm really hoping for some engagement from all of you. Thanks so much for sitting with me through that intensity.
Right, Nicole, thank you hugely for that. That was extraordinary. I'm catching breath a little myself. First and foremost, we've got a few minutes, about 10 minutes for questions. As Jo was saying, we've got the technology to hear directly from people. If you would like to unmute and ask Nicole a question, I suppose you could raise your reaction hand if you wanted to do that. Otherwise, I'm happy to take chat questions. I have one. It's not very well thought through But one of the questions that comes to my mind, or it's not really a question, it's just sort of an alongside thought, is that the shame frame around the 70s was Hewett coming into the libertarian 70s in Sydney as a relief from her party days. And that one of the possible operations here is that sexuality had a particular freight and importance politically for as women in the Communist Party. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I think that's very clearly a kind of explicit part of the shift in some of Hewett's orientation as a writer from the 60s through to the 70s, and also in her aspirations as a playwright too, broadly. And part of why she was so keen to move to Sydney from Perth in 1973 is this sense of Sydney as a site of liberation. But it's also important to note that she was writing, particularly in her poetry, in a very confessional way through the 60s. So even before she resigns from the Communist Party, she's trying to be quite explicit about sex in her poetry in the mid-60s, in 66, 67, 68. She's also having big affairs in that period. So, and she's not hiding them, she's writing about them, she's naming the men she has affairs with in her poetry collections in the 60s. And as Kate has emphasised as well, some of the forms of behaviour that they were subject to began before they moved to Sydney as well, which is important to note. But certainly in terms of a milieu, or in terms of if we're trying to talk about a broader clash between forms of emotional regimes, if we want to use such a frame, then you can see that Sydney, for all of Australia, I think, was really focusing some of that clash in its cultural world, in the cultural world in particular.
Thank you. Lynn, and then I think I've got a question here from Bridget. Yep.
Nicole, I want to say thanks very much. That was just breathtaking in more ways than one, and really powerful. One quick personal note, and then I've got a question for you. Having read a fair bit of Dorothy Hewett over the 70s and in the 80s.
As you have, Lynn, yes, thank you very much.
Your paper just puts back on me what I didn't read, what I didn't see, what I didn't understand. Although part of when you were speaking, I was thinking, I did admire her. I did not want to be her, but I saw her as this liberated, wild, unsuburban, fantastic creation. So I suppose I was split in that way. I guess my question to you is, how is all of this and all the revelations that are coming here and the framing you're putting around Hewett, how is it impacting on you as a reader and as a researcher? I mean, it must be very difficult to keep on researching in this area in a personal way.
I think, as all of you have come with me through this last 45 minutes of some quite intense, I think intense is an inadequate word here, but some witnessing to some hurt and damage that I hope we all feel great sympathy for, and we all carry as a kind of burden. But it's nothing to what Kate and Rose carry with them every day, all the time. I really want to emphasise that. It's really nothing compared to that. And so I am trying to take seriously that this biography that I'm writing has to tell the whole truth. And that's some of the gift that Dorothy gave us too, that she insisted to some degree on a kind of candour. And if the candour plays against her, that's what's going to happen. From my point of view, I guess. I'm interested in the whole picture of what a complex woman she was. And I also feel a little licensed in that from Kate's work and Rose's emphasis on complexity in the continuing reception of their mother's work. That we do have a sense that what we're trying to work with is a whole picture across most of the 20th century, and a particular kind of figuring of a project that I think in the 70s tried to do something that, as you can say, it had a kind of glamour, it had a kind of excitement. It tried to be in a space that was new and important for women, but it did it in a way that was hugely damaging for the women most closest to her. And that's a terrible paradox that we somehow have to work with and live with I hope that's useful.
Yeah. I've got two questions pending. One written from Bridget, and then Julianne, I believe, has her hand up. From Bridget, from the chat. Bridget, do you want to say it, or you're happy for me to read it out?
I'll read it. I'll say it.
Okay.
I was just remembering the 70s, actually. What a strange time it was, and the weird contradictions that women had to deal with. And I was very taken with the idea of the refusal of shame as kind of drive there. So I just had a very general question about whether you had thought about it in relation to other figures to emerge from that time or in that time. I mean, that's a ridiculous question, but anyway, you can leave it as a comment if you like.
Oh, it's a tough one. Helen Garner is a really interesting one. I think she's been asked about what she thinks about the Hewett controversy. She, met them late in life, thought they were nice people is what she said, condemned the sexual abuse very strongly. But yeah, of course, she, in her condemnation of her attempts to teach sexual education in high schools in Melbourne, subject to some of the same kinds of what we could say are conventional scriptures. I mean, it's important also to not think of the 70s as triumphant in its liberatory narratives. It was still fighting against very strong forms of conventional forms of morality at the same time. Jeff Sparrow makes the great point that if we're looking for another model of treatment of child sexuality that may be worse and more damaging than the Catholic Church is very present as a different kind of model of child sexuality that was much, much worse than this to some degree. So, it's important to keep these in context, I guess, as a bigger picture about what the 70s was. But the cultural dimension is really interesting for me about what it is that I guess these cultural forms of production were trying to do in opening up the space for what could be seen and heard and spoken and experienced and understood.
Julianne, thank you, Bridget. Thanks, Nicole. Julianne.
Nicole, thank you for that. It was just a really interesting and really timely discussion. Thank you. I wanted to draw on a little bit on what you were talking about in terms of the kind of the role of the Me Too movement in prosecuting some of these issues outside of the nation state, and how this kind of discussion is playing out now, especially on social media. And I guess following from Lynn's question a little about what it means to write this kind of complex picture of someone who was complicit in this kind of situation now. I'm thinking about just the discussion that's been on social media about Miles Franklin the last few days, and just thinking about now to give airtime to a writer to someone who has perpetrated this kind of thing is in itself kind of quite controversial now in the kind of the situation in which speaking about this kind of thing is difficult and fraught in the public eye. I'm just wondering how you're feeling about that, the situation of writing this book now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to allude to that to some degree. I mean, in the paper, in my use of just specifically, I want to focus on the men as the perpetrators. Hugh is not a perpetrator, but she's certainly complicit and certainly a madam. She even uses the word in a poem. So that sense where Kate has devastatingly said it felt like being in a brothel. This is some of the role we can think of that Hewett even conceives of for herself to some degree. The space for speaking, the space for making complexity, it's very difficult if we can't talk about all of the evidence, including, so I mean, I had to grapple quite a lot, and Kate and Rose themselves have given me some great feedback about the question of including some of the poetry from the men in there, and what that entails for us reading it from 1979. There's a whole lot of damage we could read if that's how we're going to read it. We may not necessarily read it that way in some of that archive. So the evidentiary question is a real one for thinking about how we work with an archive of abusers. Neruda's poem, I didn't put it in there. It's nevertheless out there. I'm not censoring it. It's out there. Everyone can read it. It's a fantastic poem. But I'm not putting it in there. I'm not giving him that particular space because of that context. So, I mean, we all fight for space in contemporary debate. And we just have to be careful, I think, about making sure that the ways in which we bring voices to these discussions further it in ways that aren't aren't conceivable as harmful, and that we bring with us a sense of real impact on those who have voiced harm, and that those who have voiced harm are active and agentful in making the decisions about how that happens, which can mean that some things are shut, and we have to also live with that to some degree.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're at 3:01, everyone. Are there any more questions? Yes, just one more. Yep.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks, Nicole. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Anne. I thought you were Jennifer Pender. Nice to see you.
No, sorry about that. It's my middle name. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm just sort of pushing in a slightly different direction, but really following up, I guess, Julianne and Lynn. I mean, I guess as the biographer, my question is, to what extent should and do the adult children who are alive have the last word? How are you, as a biographer, I guess, trying to work with the fact that their stories can derail or whatever, submerge her story? It's such a tricky thing that you're dealing with there as a biographer, and that's really come across as very interesting in your presentation. So I'm just wondering how you deal with that, because it is so difficult to juggle all the perspectives when you do biography and make sure that person's story, who is the focus, the subject of the biography.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious, and in fact, it's because I took some time, 2020, before I really wanted to talk about Kate and Rose's stories as Hewett's biographer, because I really wanted to make sure that their stories were heard on their own terms. And that's, I think, really important for what I'm doing, that they have control over that space, over their own stories, and that their very accomplished voices can be heard as in their own right. It's really important. It's a very, very crowded and noisy space, the Hewett Archive and the Hewett Live. Hewett's voice itself is massively loud. It can be really hard for me to even get a voice in with Dorothy, let alone all the children. So that the six of them all have, strong opinions. Besides, every person I ever speak to about Hewett, I'm sure you know this, has a story to tell. Like some of you here have stories to tell that you can tell me at some point. So every single person has a story to tell. So that is really part of the huge challenge of this biography, is to find a way through that gives us a coherent or a narrative that will take us in some way that is making sense and that's sensible. But I don't want it to be too singular, It's the complexity of it is real, and the multifocal paradoxes are real. I mean, I think, it's Imani Lee who says about Virginia Woolf's really appalling treatment of her servants and her classism. There is no reconciling that contradiction in her aesthetics. There is no reconciling it, and there may be no reconciling. We just have to try and find some balance, or try and find a description for that irreconcilability, I guess.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks.
With my eye on the time, very regretfully, and just to add that it's been an absolute treat and an important, it seems to me, to be part of this gathering. Nicole, thank you so much for your lecture. I know that we'll all have time in the future to have the after lecture hubbub and carry on.
I would love that.
I'm sure if people have follow-up things that they want to give you and to bear witness with you and anyone else, importantly watching, that they can do that. Nevertheless, we have had this chance, and I'm extremely grateful for it. I don't know, everyone joins me. So can we all give Nicole a round of applause insofar as we can? So I hope you can hear the hubbub.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole.
See you in the streams.